Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Dr. Neda Bolourchi joins us today, and we talk about the assassination of the Iranian Major General of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Qasem Soleimani, by the U.S. military. Was it a punishment for past actions or an attempt at deterrence toward Iran, or both? We discuss the impact on the people of Iraq and Iran and the recent protests, the prospects for retaliation by Iran, and war throughout the region. Dr. Bolourchi teaches at Rutgers University-New Brunswick, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. She's a thought leader whose work crosses multiple fields, from the academic to the legal to foreign policy and more. Her academic research examines the transformative discourse on Iran during the 20th century across the political and religious spectra. She completed years of research in Iran, Syria, and Armenia, and she provided foreign policy and security analysis and commentary for various publications and news channels internationally. She previously worked on matters of civil litigation and white-collar criminal defense. Her legal work includes international and comparative analysis of human rights violations in the Middle East. We recorded this on January 3rd, 2020. Neda Bolourchi is here talking to us from Rutgers University here in New Jersey. Hello, Neda. Thank you so much for giving me a little bit of time on such a busy day, news of Iran. So thanks for joining the show.
Thank you. My pleasure to be back, Joanne.
So just to let our audience know, the topic that we had planned to talk about was the uprisings in Iran, and to offer some nuance about, why the protests were happening, what the different factions are, and just some nuance on that, because we don't get that generally here in Western media in general. But we are now, basically, we're chasing a moving target because developments keep happening. And so we've talked before, and we're updating our conversation. And in the process of that, we had the assassination of Soleimani last night. So that has sort of changed everything. And our conversation, I think everyone wants to hear experts' opinions on this. So that's going to dominate our conversation today. But because of the comments from some prominent Americans, like Secretary of State Pompeo, and others who are saying, oh, well, this is great. This is a great change for the world. And there are Iraqis cheering in the streets. So we can still touch on the likely reactions of the people who were protesting in Iraq and in Iran, and sort of how that has all changed. Is that an accurate way of sort of framing this, Neda?
I think that's a great way of framing it, because the conversation has dramatically changed. We have gone from seeing protests, what are largely portrayed as anti-Iranian protests in Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran itself, to just a couple of days ago, anti-American protests in Iraq. And this specific targeting by Secretary of State Pompeo that there are Iraqis who are dancing in the streets of Iraq. I mean, this is very reminiscent of sort of the images conjured about the Iraq invasion. And
exactly.
What they really miss is that, Iraqi society, like any society, is not hegemonic. It is not, dominated by one group, one political thought process. And so when he points out that image, or also Ari Fleischer was on Fox News last night saying the exact same thing, and even going as far as to say Iranians would be dancing in the street. This is at best trying to sort of convey and assuage sort of American viewers, if not the larger world, and at worst is just ignorant of the facts. And so what is more accurate is to understand that we have a heterogeneous society in Iraq, as we do in Iran and in Lebanon. And so, yes, were some Iraqis dancing in the street? Yes. Likely those who, if participated in the anti-Iran protests for the last several months. And so it's really important to say that you have Shias from the last several months who are protesting Iranian presence and corruption and lack of government services, that they were sort of seen as not delivering on their promises. And you have a long-time Sunni population who were not participating in these more recent protests because they didn't want to be targeted. So you will have across the board in Iraq different groups of people who are very happy about the assassination of Soleimani for a variety of reasons. So to try and portray all Iraqis as one type of people or one people with one thinking or outlook, it is a very good attempt at trying to convince the American population and the broader international community that this was a good thing. But it should, we have to really reiterate that we have heterogeneous and cosmopolitan societies. And what this has done is it changes. So in addition to that, we now move, in the course of 1 week, we've gone from having anti-Iranian protests that had been going on for several months. Soleimani was in Iraq working, to the point of why he's targeted. He was working on the new sort of appointment of a prime minister. There's a caretaker prime minister who was in line, who was, was being pressured by Sunnis to take an, I don't want to say an anti-Iranian stance, but to reduce the influence of Iran on Iraqi Hezbollah, right? And so this was dynamic that was going on as of last week, that the several-month protest had made some traction, and that this was a conversation that was happening. Soleimani was involved with those conversations. And the attack on Kirkuk and the response to that attack by the United States by targeting 5 different camps, 5 different Iraqi Hezbollah camps, changed the conversation dramatically. And that's why you saw the Iraqi Hezbollah outside and protesting at the U.S. Embassy. It's important to point out that protest, there was no intention, from what I can see, to overrun the American embassy in Baghdad. No one showed up with armaments that would be able to do that.
Right.
So any attempt to do that wouldn't take into consideration exactly what that structure is. It is one of the most fortified buildings in the world, and it's enormous. I also have a friend, I think I've told you before, I was in Damascus, Syria before the war broke out there. I have a friend that I met there who is inside the American embassy. And from his perspective, he was like, there's an egress and an entrance that there was a fire put in, so we can't use those two. Makeshift battering ram was used. They did get a popular mobilization unit flag up over the American embassy. And he was actually, your listeners may see it on video, he was the Marine who brought it down. And so it looks very scary on TV. It is not a great place, obviously, to be when it's happening. But in the scheme of sort of on the ground reactions, it was nowhere near a Benghazi. And understandably, the president wanted to take action to prevent that. And that's why you had additional Marines sent in and more forces sent to the Persian Gulf. But I think we might want to think about the assassination of Soleimani as well as 4 or 5 other Iranian military personnel were included in this assassination. And think of this not necessarily as retribution for the protests at the American embassy, but maybe more in terms of punishment for past action. So it is Soleimani, in addition to a general, a colonel, a major, a captain, and then included in this assassination was Iraqi Hezbollah. And I would also point out to your listeners that across the way, it included a member of Lebanese Hezbollah was taken out. So I think we can look at what just transpired not as really retribution for the protests at the American embassy, but punishment for past actions, and I think in the Trump administration's thought process, deterrence for future actions, and not really about the American embassy itself. And so, and particularly because it included Lebanese Hezbollah. And so I wonder if this was also not a coordinated effort between maybe American and Israeli forces because of the Lebanese aspect of this. And so one important thing here is there was no attack on Iranian territory. The Iraqis, again, going back to your starting question, are going to be upset because this is another violation of Iraqi sovereignty.
Right.
And so I think in many ways, people across the Middle East, one, they're already on heightened sort of alert, as it were, because all of these countries are fearful for what's going to be coming down in terms of Iranian retaliation. And many of them really just think that this is another example of U.S. not being able to honestly to let go. I've seen it categorized as racism, that the United States thinks that it can just, in essence, bomb the Middle East at will, and that as long as it's over there, it doesn't really matter.
Right. Now, I'm trying to decide where to go from this. One thing I just will mention, and of course, this is this is less than 24 hours, so information is going to change. That's to be expected. I am seeing from Elijah Magne that there were no Lebanese Hezbollah killed in this. So we'll have to see how that plays out. I don't know how much difference it makes in your analysis, and that could change again. So, but I guess, well, first of all, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad issued a security alert, and not just any security alert. They told any Americans in Iraq to depart Iraq immediately, to try to use airlines while possible, and failing that, to other countries via land. So, that shows the kind of risk that has now put all Americans in Iraq. I would think that it's not just going to be Iraq that's going to be a dangerous place. I would think it's going to be across the region, given that Soleimani, though there are plenty of Americans who have never forgotten any role that Soleimani's played in any conflict, but particularly the Iraq War. And when they talk about how he killed hundreds of Americans and wounded thousands, what are they talking about? A recent shadow war, or are they going back to the Iraq invasion and the Iraq War in the early 2000s?
Yes, so the latter. So generally, when people talk about how many American soldiers Soleimani is responsible for either their deaths or injuries, they're talking about a specific time following the invasion where the Shia, at this point we're calling them Shia militias, started rising. And so it very much was Soleimani who was behind, or is sort of, by all intelligence information, is the one responsible for those attacks. And so because of that history, you don't have sort of former military or intelligence officials. They believe the president when he says, well, Soleimani was planning something. I think that many people actually would like to be debriefed on that, including members of Congress, because it's been a while, right?
Yeah.
Your history is always going to be with you. It's always present. And so I think in that sense, everyone is very cautious and or insistent that there be a debriefing about this, and that we don't have a wag the dog situation, that the intelligence is accurate, that it was sort of verified by the American intelligence community, and not just handed to us by an ally. And so and largely exactly to your point is to not just bring up Soleimani's past as evidence for the present.
Right. And, you know, we could fight old wars forever. That would be my concern. But the other thing is that the more recent history in 2013, 14, 15, I thought that some of that had been resolved because my understanding is that when the Iraqi military collapsed under attack by ISIS, my understanding was that Obama was reluctant to jump in and help the Iraqi military, in part because we wanted a reason to redeploy some troops and military bases in Iraq. And so when the militias, who, are tend to defend locally, when they needed help, it was Soleimani who stepped in and provided some help to fight against ISIS. And I thought at that point there was even just a loose coalition of people fighting against ISIS, that there was at least some common ground there. And is that accurate? And are we just going to erase that part of history and go back to things that happened in 2005 and through, 2005 to 10 time frame, or what is the situation there?
No, your understanding is exactly correct. Soleimani, part of the reason that he is heralded is not just because of his earlier efforts in Iraq, but very much that he helped Iraqis and largely the popular mobilization units fight against ISIS. So there was this tentative this tentative truce, as it were, in the sense that when Obama did, you have John Kerry on video saying we thought that we could control ISIS. The United States thought it could control ISIS, and it grew so popular, it grows too fast. And then you had the removal of American soldiers from Mosul. And so one thing just led to another, and in essence, the overrunning of Iraq by ISIS. And it was very much Soleimani who shuttled back and forth between Iran and Iraq, and then, of course, Syria and Iraq, and tirelessly spent time and effort, energy, capital, and I mean social capital, political capital, as well as physical money, to make sure that that ISIS could be pushed back and defeated. And this is very much in line with the Iranian belief of what's called what they generally call a forward defense, where if you are not in one of these other countries helping in that fight, then the fight is going to come home to you, i.e. if they're not fighting in Syria, if they're not fighting in Iraq, then ISIS or another force will be invading Iran. And so this is Soleimani's presence all across the region is more recently part and parcel of this forward defense posture that Iran has. And that's not going to change.
Right.
So this was initially part of what it thought of as its defensive posture or its leverage against the United States and Israel, and increasingly in the last couple of years, Saudi Arabia. But it was very much warranted and thought as being beneficial, not only in the Syrian case, but very specifically with ISIS.
Right. And when we're talking about the broader region, it wasn't just in Iraq where Soleimani and he's a very important figure, but he had a whole organization around him. My understanding is that he could be considered maybe the second most powerful person in Iran, but he also worked in Lebanon, a resistance in Lebanon, the Hezbollah. He helped the Syrians, obviously. He helped other countries, people who he worked with and trained. And so it's really not just Iraq that we're going to need to worry about, because the people who he worked with, presumably, he was very or from what I know, he was a very popular figure. They feel that he empowered local defense forces. And I guess my concern is that no matter what the heads of state tell people to do, and the heads of the religious leaders say to do, there are going to be a lot of people, fighters on the ground, who feel an allegiance, who are going to see this as a martyr situation and who may try to avenge his death.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think what's really important that you said there is that you have heads of state and you do have different groups who have leaders, but importantly, you also have individuals. And I think one thing really that increasingly that we've seen with the Trump administration is that they don't want to understand how proxy groups work, and it fits within their larger narrative. And so from the Iranian perspective, Iran looks at what it calls its friends and allies and says, we can call them, we can ask them to do something, we can suggest that they do something, we can suggest that they not do something. And they're very clear if, when you speak with Iranian officials and trying to convince you, so to be fair, that they don't demand something. And similarly, when you're on the ground talking to someone who's part of a group, they say, look, I'm not here because of the money, right? Americans focus on money because that's how they operate. I'm here, yes, I get paid, but I believe in the cause, right? Whether it's nationalism, whether it's a local thing, whether it's just making sure that you are 50 miles away from your house and that, ISIS doesn't get to your house. So these are all really important things to understand about how proxy groups work, is that just because you've associated them with a state actor doesn't mean that the non-state actor just takes orders. And so we do need to make some distance there. And I bring that up because in your question and concern about individuals, Soleimani just didn't operate on a vertical level, right? It isn't that he is allegedly the number two most second powerful person in Iran, and how it is that he came to be so close to Iran's leader Khamenei, but also that because of sort of his background, sort of, as they say, humble beginnings, he operates very well horizontally. And so it isn't just across leadership in organizations throughout the Middle East, but that he is known and spends time with soldiers on the ground, that he is very much a battlefield operator as well as a strategician. And so, in the United States military, usually if you have somebody who is in policy or strategy, they are no longer going to be on the battlefield. They will probably not rise beyond a 3-star. I think that's my understanding. That is not the case with Soleimani, right? He is was the commander of the Quds force, but he operated very well horizontally and vertically. And so you may indeed have some people who are ordered to not do certain things. The Iranian government may say that it will take, reprisal and retribution on its own, but you can never ensure that somebody is actually going to listen to you.
Right. Now, just to go back a little bit to the uprising in Iraq, a lot of it was generated by economic issues. A lot of it was, in relation to sanctions, but not only that. What is your best guess? The people who tended to protest the regime, if you will. I hate to use that word because it's so unequally used. The government in Iraq, the leadership in in Iran. So how do you think that might change the sentiment? I mean, a long time ago, I read a long article about just everyday Iranians and their expectations of whether or not they would be attacked by the United States. And essentially it said that they have a pretty firm belief that there's just a very good chance that Iran will be attacked by the United States. And no matter what gripes they have against each other, against their leadership, there is a unifying factor in that. And that would sort of override everything else when they're under attack. Is this going to sort of quell some of the other issues, or are they going to stay there? Are they going to decide, we got to get this government out of here because they're endangering us? Like, how do you think it's going to affect the dissidents in Iran?
I definitely think that it will quell them. I mean, going back to the November protests, we'll start there in the sense that when you had the removal of subsidies on oil, had the protests amongst the lower classes in Iran. And so this is very much the population that supports the Islamic Republic. And the removal of those subsidies was, in fact, a mechanism to then give them direct subsidies, right? And so you had an outrageous response to these protests. The violence used against those protesters in November was unacceptable. And the death rate has spiked since then. There was a Reuters article that's talking about 1,000 to 1,500 people dead. The confirmation is still not available on those numbers. And once the first week had transpired, you then had a quelling of these protesters, and the Iranian government knew going into Christmas that the religious ceremonies would be happening in commemoration of those killed. And so that would happen on the 40th day, which coincides with our Christmas. And so that mourners would be going to cemeteries, that those who had bodies would be going to participate in the commemoration ceremonies of the dead. And so there are a handful of cemeteries, particularly around Tehran and near Karaj, that were watched. Security forces were out at those cemeteries. Parents were told not to attend or invite large crowds to those ceremonies. Some have subsequently, parents have been arrested. And so this is what has been transpiring between the November protests and this week, in the sense that parents have been defying the Iranian government because of the unparalleled use of violence against either protesters or innocent bystanders in the November protests. So all of this, as well as some of the Iraqi protests against the Iranian government, you should see, on the Iranian side, absolutely quelled. Iranian nationalism, as well as the combination of fear of reprisal from the Iranian government, will shut down to the largest extent protesters. I don't want to fully call them dissidents in Iran. There will be no room to maneuver in Iran for Iranians against the government. And then in Iraq, the conversation has thoroughly changed, where, yes, you do have, the atmosphere is different. The society, Iran, again, doesn't control Iraq. It doesn't make necessarily certain orders directly to all members of the PMU or all Shia parliamentarians. And so that sort of the nuance in the conversation about removing US forces in Iraq, that was what was transpiring, as it was also pushing against the Iranians. So exactly what ends up transpiring in Iraq as a result of this is very much up in the air. I imagine both will remain, right? So if we were looking to see less American troops in Iraq, that's already not happened. If anyone was looking to see Iranian forces at least allow for or deliver more to Iraq, that's not going to happen. And so we may just end up, the question is exactly how is Iran going to retaliate? I think almost everyone believes that Iran will retaliate inside of Iraq, that Iraq will become the front line in a war. I'm not sure that Iran is, there are two ways one could think about it. Iran will retaliate and retaliate immediately, harshly, and sort of in the language of like a big blow. But this would be conventional thinking, in the sense that as if Iran is operates on a symmetrical level. It doesn't. It engages in asymmetrical warfare. So I would almost imagine that Iran's retaliation might be something small. It would be considered sort of like a decoy, where people believe that it is the retaliation. And then there would sort of be this lull. And then we would see a much bigger attack, as it were. Probably not in Iraq, maybe not inside the Middle East. where it would be big, ambiguous, and very costly and expensive, and would also demonstrate sort of a prowess in intelligence gathering, very much along the lines of the Aramco attacks. But I don't think it would, Iran has carried out attacks in Germany and Argentina, so let us not think that Iran is contained only within the Middle East. So these are sort of two obvious ways I think one could think about retaliation.
I think one last thing, there's an article in the New York Times by Michael Duran from the Hudson Institute, and he's, praising taking out what he calls the architect of the Islamic Republic's decades-long active campaign of violence against the United States and its allies, especially Israel. And he talks about how he built Hezbollah in Lebanon, and he spent the last decade, says, quote, replicating the Hezbollah model in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And he says that he built a quote unquote empire of militias. And then he says, it seemed that Trump feared getting sucked into a war, which it certainly did. Yeah, up to, 2 days ago, he said he didn't want a war with Iran. And then he said that he orchestrated attacks by Iranian proxies on Americans. Again, I guess he's going back to the Iraq War for that one. And then basically he says that this is he calls it the final demise of Mr. Obama's Middle East strategy, and that Trump, by contrast, realized that Tehran's goal was to replace America as a key player in the Middle East. And then he says, quote, and the United States has no choice, unquote. Says that if it seeks to stay in the Middle East, but to check Iran's military power on the ground. The title of this is Trump's ground game against Iran. He says that from his own experience as a former senior official in the White House and Defense Department, the United States has had several past opportunities to kill Soleimani, but each time decided against it. And he goes on with Soleimani's been waging war on America and its allies for years, was directly engaged in the planning of attacks. And then, he talks about the joyous videos to social media. And, all of this boils down to the United States now has no choice but to stay in the Middle East and I interpret this as saying fight a ground war against Iran. And this seems to be very much the pro-Israel lobby perspective. And so I just wonder if this is ever going to end.
I don't think so. I mean, for every non-interventionist, and even those who do not like the president for whatever domestic or foreign policy reasons, he has been very serious about trying to remove American troops from the Middle East. He hasn't been successful. He makes statements coming that say that there will be a troop reduction, and there hasn't been a full reduction to zero. There are 5,000 or were 5,000 in Iraq. We have been seeing increasing number of troops going to the Middle East. Some of this, I think, is it's in response to, I was in Bahrain for the Manama Dialogue in November, Arab allies insisting that something has to be done about Iran. The Pentagon also sent, at the moment I currently don't remember who was there, but who insisted that the administration was taking care of its friends and allies in the Persian Gulf and the surrounding areas by sending more personnel, by sending more equipment and armaments. And so your question, I think, and that article goes to the assassination of Soleimani and the 4 or 5 other individuals who were with him, has more to do with the past than it does with the present.
Right.
That this was a punishment, but that the Trump administration also believes that it's a message to Iran to say, we have you everywhere, right? That the the W. Bush administration as well as the Obama administrations had the possibility to do this. I think it was largely known, or maybe it was an open secret, that they had this capability. They chose not to do it because the scenarios that were run internally in those administrations said that war would be produced. I think that the Trump administration is saying to the Iranians, we have your number. I mean, one way to look at this is, we have your number. You step foot outside of Iran, we will get you. And that this is a sort of implicit deterrence, not only as a punishment for the past, but a deterrence for the future, to say, you are now, if you are not going to behave yourselves inside your own country, we are no longer going to take it outside of your country. And one of the things, the other way to sort of look at what happened yesterday is that this was an intelligence operation, right? Mm-hmm. That and that it has been a successful one in the sense that where Soleimani goes, the United States has been aware of it. And so those are a couple of messages that are being sent. And of course, we come back to the question of, well, what is Iran going to do in response? And so I don't, even though the administration has said that American personnel should be leaving Iraq, I don't think that is going to translate into the removal of American forces from the Middle East.
If the Iraqi government, if the Iraqi parliament demands that American troops withdraw from Iraq, do you think that will be ignored? Oh, I think I lost you.
No, you didn't. I'm sorry. I'm just thinking, in the sense of, that I think I sort of alluded to that earlier, is that there was going to be a vote to remove U.S. forces in Iraq. That was supposedly going to be happening, if not next week, in the next 2 weeks. And so does this change that dynamic? Is that vote going to happen in the Iraqi parliament? And will this action by the United States convince enough I don't want to just say the Sunnis will the Shias will automatically go to the Iranian and Hezbollah side, but will this convince enough Iraqi parliamentarians that maybe now they have some room against Iranian forces or Iranian supported forces? To be honest, that I don't think that there's enough people who will vote have the United States removed. Gotcha. I don't think that part of this, the tit for tat of the last several years in Iraq has been that it is largely, it's not a super majority, as it were, that there aren't enough on either side to force either Iran or the United States out of Iraq. And I don't think that has changed. Even if Iraqi nationalism is even more embarrassed, even if they're more insulted than they were on Monday, I think it will somehow get contained, and the status quo will hold. I think it will hold, and then we'll see if Iraq becomes frontline.
Right, and especially since there's a leadership crisis. There's all the fractures in the Shia coalition are more obvious than ever. So yeah, I think that's a good guess. I don't think it's going to be smooth, but yeah, I have my doubts too that they will be able to expel the troops. And there's just a whole bunch of things that we can do. We can start throwing money at. There's all kinds of things that we could do. Carrots and sticks. Not that I think it's a good thing. I just see too many reminders or just recycling of things that didn't go well in the past, sort of happening again. But I guess that all of that remains to be seen.
Well, that's true. And I would just like to point out that deterrence is not always a stick. Right, that has been sort of the analogy used for 40 years, is that whichever administration it is, will sanction Iran into submission, will overthrow that government, will do sort of all these things that are basically sticks, right? This particular administration has taken, as one official told me, literally a hammer, and in their attempt to deter Iran, to get Iran to renegotiate. And I would just point out, sometimes deterrence is also, if we're going to go with this carrot stick analogy, it is also a carrot, right? In the sense that regardless of what one's opinion on the nuclear deal might have been, Iranian behavior did change. And the fact, and everyone wants to say, well, the removal of sanctions, this much money paid. But what they're forgetting is that the Obama administration, in very scalpel-like precision, didn't remove all the sanctions on Iran. They removed the nuclear sanctions, but Iranians were still under terrorist sanctions. And so this is actually what Iranians were upset about. And the Obama administration's response to the Iranians were, one, it's not our job, either the Treasury Department or the State Department, to help you with European businesses or to get money flowing. And two, if you actually want to conduct international business, then you have to work on getting yourself off the terrorist list. And so I would just sort of point out that let's take a look at where actually now the world stands 2 years later, or just we can even just go with May 2nd of 2019, either way, and look at where we are. And I'm not sure when dealing, or I shouldn't say I'm not sure, when dealing with the Iranians, the stick is not proven to be fruitful. We'll see if that changes, but historically it hasn't proven to be fruitful.
Right. And I mean, I thought that Trump's goal was to bring them back to the table to renegotiate the Iran deal and to be able to walk away and say, oh, look, I got a better deal. And I really thought that's how he was going to approach this. But I think that's going to be a lot harder now. I think that goal is going to be a lot more difficult to achieve. But as far as Iraq goes, I mean, there are people there who are still desperate for potable water and electricity.
Exactly.
So there are a lot of things that could, just out of desperation, convince them to do one thing or another. So, yeah, this remains. But you're also asking. You're asking an entire region to give up their resistance to. And a very aggressive empire. You can't call it anything else but an empire. So I don't know. I don't know. This is a real conundrum. And anyway, I really should let you go. And anything else that you would like to offer, please do. And especially your time is extremely under demand right now, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us at a time when people really, would like to hear a reasonable expert voice on that and an honest voice, and that's what you are, and I really do appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and I hope, despite the fact that we're on January 3rd and the year does not look good, I hope there is some reversal. But I would say, as I normally do, look in the short term at what happens and then look down the road for the long term. I think Iran will continue its long game.
Okay. Thank you so much. And Happy New Year. And let's hope for the best.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Neda Bolourchi. Find her at LinkedIn and find her work on her Rutgers University Center for Middle Eastern Studies webpage. The Around the Empire podcast, independent media. Your support is really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. There are many ways to find and to listen to this podcast. You can find it on any mobile podcast app or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire, and we'll see you next time. Happy New Year. Take care, everyone.